Abraham climbs the mountain. Isaac walks beside him. The firewood is on the son's back. The fire is in the father's hand. And then the question that spans generations. What if Abraham had said no? What if he had stopped there? What if he had protected his son? But is the purpose lost? This video is not about sacrifice. It's about decisions that define generations. Stay until the end. The last point reveals something that few people notice in this text. Like and subscribe, because this type of message isn't found just anywhere. God calls Abraham at an unusual time. Not when he is lost. Not when you're in the desert without direction. But only when the promise has already been fulfilled. Isaac was born. Laughter arrived. The wait is over. That's precisely where God speaks. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, and he offers it as a sacrifice. The calling is not about creating something new. He comes to confront what has already been received. Here begins the true test of faith, because there is a type of faith that trusts in God before the promise. And there is another type, much rarer, who trusts only after the promise is fulfilled. The text of Genesis 22 speaks more than just of obedience. He talks about attachment. God is not asking if Abraham believes. God is asking who occupies the center of the heart. What if Abraham had said no at that moment? It wouldn't be an open rebellion. It would be something more subtle, more acceptable, more understandable. He could have said, God, it was the Lord who promised. It was the Lord who gave it. How can the Lord ask for it back? This is the point where many people stop, when the calling starts to seem contradictory. Because even trusting in God in times of scarcity is possible. But trusting Him when He touches what is most beloved requires another measure of faith. God's request is not cruel. He is surgical. God doesn't ask for Isaac because He wants blood. He asks for Isaac because He wants Abraham's whole heart. Every promise, if not placed on an altar, runs the risk of becoming an idol. And idols don't have to be fake. They just need to be absolute. Abraham is faced with a silent choice. To protect the present or to obey the voice. To hold on to the miracle or to trust in the God of miracles. If he says no here, he'll stay with Isaac. But something breaks down within the relationship with God. Because faith is not just about receiving. Faith is giving back when God asks. The most striking thing right now is that God doesn't explain it. He doesn't say why. He doesn't promise a refund. He doesn't guarantee a happy ending. He just calls. This reveals a profound pattern in the Scriptures. God always calls His servants beyond logic. Because faith that depends on explanations is not faith. It's a calculation. Abraham had already walked with God for years. You've already made a mistake. Have you ever tried to help God with your own hands? He has already reaped the consequences of that. Now God touches on exactly that point. In the place where Abraham learned to love deeply. And that's where the test becomes generational. Because the way Abraham responds here doesn't only affect him. It affects Isaac. It affects Jacob. It affects Israel. It affects everyone who comes after. If Abraham says no, the story continues. But the revelation changes. God is not looking for servants who merely make promises. He seeks hearts that trust even when the promise is put at risk. The calling that challenges the promise does not come to destroy. It comes to reveal. To reveal whether God is a means. Or is He the end? And even before climbing the mountain, before the firewood, before the silence, before the knife, the most important decision has already been required. Because all true faith begins here. At the moment when God asks for exactly what you never imagined you would give. And the next step will reveal something even more difficult. What happens when God is silent? And the journey continues. Abraham receives no new words. There is no confirmation. There is no explanation. There is no voice from heaven the next day. The order has been given. And after that, silence. The text says that he gets up at dawn. Chop the firewood. Saddle the donkey. Call 2 servants. Leva Isaac. Everything is done with precision. But nothing is done with relief. God says nothing more. And that's what makes the journey so arduous. 3 days of hiking. 3 days grappling with the same question. 3 days without knowing if he heard correctly. 3 days without the feeling of approval. This is one of the greatest tests of faith. When God speaks once, and then remains silent. Because while God speaks, the soul is sustained. But when he is silent, only those who have truly chosen to obey remain. What if Abraham had stopped on the 2nd day? Who would accuse him? Who would judge him? He could say that the silence was a sign. Perhaps I had misunderstood. God would surely speak again if it were truly his will. But silence is not absence. Silence is a burden. God remains silent not to confuse, but to reveal what moves us when there is no emotion, no certainty, no spiritual feeling. Abraham walks knowing he could lose everything. The son, the future, the meaning of the promise. And yet, he continues. Here a harsh truth is born. Not all obedience is accompanied by immediate peace. Sometimes, it comes accompanied by anguish. Mount Moriah doesn't appear out of nowhere. He appears in the distance, on the 3rd day. Until then, every step is a silent sermon. Each step is a renewed decision. Isaac walks beside his father. Probably a conversation. He probably smiled. He probably doesn't understand anything. And Abraham carries everything inside. This reveals something profound about spiritual maturity. There are pains that cannot be explained. There are decisions that cannot be shared. There are callings that need to be experienced in silence. If Abraham had given up along the way, no one would have known. There was no crowd. There was no altar set up. There was no visible record. It was just him, God, and the decision. This is where many people stop. Not at the time of the call, but in the interval between the order and its execution. When faith doesn't receive emotional fuel. When prayer seems to hit the ceiling. When the sky seems overcast. God's silence is not punishment. It's a sieve. He separates those who follow based on conviction from those who follow based on feeling. Abraham doesn't walk because he feels something. He's walking because he heard something. And that changes everything. Because faith isn't about keeping your heart warm. It's about keeping your feet moving. The most striking aspect of this passage is that the Bible records no communication between Abraham and God during those 3 days. No prayer. No complaints. No signal request. His obedience is not noisy. It's constant. The mountain is still far away. The altar does not yet exist. The knife is still stored away. But the test is already underway. And the question echoes as he walks. I don't know if God is powerful. But is God trustworthy even when he doesn't answer? Because when God is silent, true faith does not stop. She walks. And in the next moment, the silence will be broken. Not by the voice of God. But it's the most painful question a father could hear. Silence walks beside them. But it doesn't remain intact. Isaac observes. He sees the firewood. He notices the fire. He recognizes the altar that is yet to be built. And then the question arises. Simple, direct, inevitable. Father, where is the lamb? This is not a childish question. It's a question that cuts to the core. Because Isaac does not question the sacrifice. He questions the absence. There, the test changes level. Until now, Abraham had walked in silence before God. Now, he needs to uphold his faith in front of his son. Answering God in secret is difficult enough. But answering a son requires truth without explanations. This question reveals everything. Fear. It hurts. The conflict. Isaac doesn't know it's a sacrifice. But he feels that something is not complete. And Abraham understands. He could lie. He could have swerved. He could have avoided it. But he chooses to declare something that he himself has not yet seen. God will provide the lamb for himself. This phrase is not a ready-made answer. It is a confession of faith. Abraham doesn't say that God has already provided. He says that God will provide. He speaks of the future because his faith is not based on what he sees. It's based on who called. If Abraham had said no at that moment, history would have been different. Not with a shout, but with a slight distortion. He could teach his son that God is trustworthy up to a certain point, that there are limits. There are exceptions. But Abraham chooses something more profound. He teaches Isaac to trust in God's character, not in the circumstances. This response builds something invisible within the child. A seed of faith that doesn't need explanations. Here lies a powerful principle. What you say in the midst of a crisis educates more than any speech. Isaac learns that faith isn't about understanding everything. It's like walking even without all the pieces. And Abraham learns something too. Declaring faith doesn't immediately alleviate the pain, but align your heart with heaven. The journey continues. The mountain is drawing closer. The altar will be erected. And that phrase echoes in the air. God will provide. It resonates because it has not yet come to pass. It echoes because it still hurts. It resonates because it is still a bare promise, without proof. This is the faith that God seeks. Not the faith that celebrates what has already happened, but faith sustains what has not yet been revealed. Isaac's question reveals a paradox. The son who was to be sacrificed is the same one who hears about provision. Without realizing it, Isaac becomes part of the revelation. He carries the firewood, but it also carries the promise. And here the text points to something bigger. A father, a son, a silent question, a lamb that has not yet appeared. Abraham doesn't know. Isaac doesn't understand. But the sky is already moving. What appears to be absent is actually preparation. What appears to be a delay is actually the stage being set. But none of that diminishes the importance of the moment. Because true faith does not ignore pain. She navigates the pain with confidence. The altar is not ready yet. The knife has not yet been raised. But the question has already been asked. And the answer has already been given. Now, there's no more emotional return. All that's left is to keep going until the end. And the next step will show just how far faith can go. When there is no more room for words, they arrive at the place. It's not just any mountain. It is the place that God showed him. The walk ends here, and the decision becomes visible. Abraham doesn't run. Don't hesitate. Don't argue. He builds the altar with his own hands. Stone upon stone. Like someone who knows exactly what they're doing, even without understanding everything. Each stone laid is an act of obedience. Every gesture carries eternal weight. Isaac observes. Now he understands that something has changed. The altar is over there. The firewood is stacked. The silence becomes too heavy to ignore. The text does not record a fight. No escape was reported. It doesn't record screams. This does not lessen the pain. It increases. Because the sacrifice here is not just physical. It's relational. It's emotional. It's spiritual. Abraham binds Isaac. And that says a lot. Not because Isaac is weak, but because obedience needs to be complete. Here's a crucial detail. Isaac is not a helpless child. He is strong enough to resist. But he trusts. The son trusts his father. The father trusts in God. Everything happens in layers of faith. The altar is ready. Isaac is standing on the firewood. And now there are no more distractions. The sky remains silent. This is the most dangerous point of the journey. Because here, there is no more spoken faith. Only faith put into practice. The knife is raised. This gesture is not theatrical. It's the end. Here, many would back down. Not due to a lack of declared faith, but out of fear of the cost. If Abraham had said no at that exact moment, no one would have condemned him. He had already gone too far to be called disobedient. He had already obeyed enough to appear faithful. But faith that stops at the limit of comfort is not complete faith. It's a negotiation. God never wanted Isaac to die. He wanted Abraham whole. It is not the son who is being sacrificed. It's the control. Abraham entrusts to God what he cannot recover with his own hands. This is the point where all obedience is revealed. Not at first, but in the end. God's silence here is not indifference. Pay attention. The sky is watching. Because when everything reaches its limit, faith shows its true nature. Abraham believes in something that the text doesn't explicitly state, but suggests. That God can resurrect. God does not break promises. That God remains faithful even when the path seems illogical. The raised knife is not a symbol of violence. It is a symbol of absolute trust. Trust that doesn't depend on guarantees. Trust that requires no explanation. Here, Abraham crosses an invisible boundary. He no longer controls the outcome. He simply obeys. And it is precisely at this point that heaven intervenes. But before the voice, before the Lamb, before the revelation, something has already been resolved. Abraham's heart is not divided. He passed the point of no return. And now, everything is ready for God to reveal himself in a way which is only possible after total obedience. The voice breaks through the sky at the last instant. Not before, not during, but precisely when there are no more human alternatives. Abraham, Abraham. The call is urgent. It's personal. It's final. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Heaven moves when obedience has already been resolved from within. God does not interrupt unfinished processes. He intervenes when the heart has already decided. At that moment, something powerful happens. God declares what he has always known, but now reveals. Now I know that you fear God. Not because God learned something new, but because Abraham became a new person. The test did not change God. Abraham changed. The lamb appears to be caught by its horns. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. He was already there. This reveals a profound principle. The provision never arrives late. She waits for the right time to reveal herself. God does not create the lamb after the altar. He reveals what was already prepared. The place gets a name. The Lord will provide. This name doesn't originate from theory. It is born from experience. Abraham does not call that place pain, not even a loss, not even out of fear. He calls it provision. Because when God provides, he doesn't just solve the problem. He reveals who he is. And then comes the expanded promise. Because now it's not just about Isaac. It's about generations. God speaks of numerous descendants, of nations, a blessing that reaches all the peoples of the earth. What began as a personal test, it ends up being a collective impact. This reveals something that few people realize. Obedience never stops with you. When Abraham obeys, Isaac lives. When Abraham trusts, generations are protected. If Abraham had said no, Isaac would have survived that day. But the spiritual legacy would have been broken. Because the history of faith is not built solely on miracles. It is built on difficult decisions. God was not only interested in a sacrifice that was avoided. He was building an enduring legacy. Centuries later, another father would also give up his son. But this time, there would be no intervention. The lamb that Abraham did not fully see. It would be revealed in due time. The mountain points to something bigger. The altar points to something eternal. And Abraham comes down from the mountain different from how he came up. Not because he lost something, but because he gave everything. He goes upstairs with Isaac in his arms. He descends with Isaac alive and with a revelation engraved on his soul. God is trustworthy, even when we ask for what we love most. This story is not just about Abraham. It's about you. We are all confronted with moments when God asks something of us. A decision. A delivery. A leap of faith. The question remains open. What if you say no? Perhaps nothing will change externally, but something can get lost inside. Because the greatest sacrifice was never Isaac. It was the control. If this message resonated with you, like and share it. Subscribe to the channel. Here, we're not talking about comfortable faith. We speak of true faith. And remember, the God who asks is also the God who provides.